I can't.
Oh, yes.
There's no traction.
Yeah.
There's no traction.
I know, we're all waiting. It hasn't been here yet. Hopefully.
Good afternoon. Can you hear me? Yes. Hi. Hi. I'm Jill Flandrache. Welcome to Temple Sinai, although I think everyone who's here has been here and was just here a week ago, no less. And I just want to thank everyone for their support of the program, all our friends from the interfaith community that came today. Our program, Who Knew, is a year-round program sponsored by Jewish Nevada and also by generous people in the community who have chosen to help support the program. Today, let me just give you a brief history because we're here to commemorate International Holocaust Remembrance Day, which on the calendar is tomorrow. That day, or the International Day in Memory of the Victims of the Holocaust, commemorates the victims of the Holocaust, which resulted in the genocide of 1/3 of the Jewish people, along with countless members of other minorities by Nazi Germany between 1933 and 45. In their attempt to implement its final solution to the Jewish question, January 27th was chosen to commemorate the date when the Auschwitz concentration camp was liberated by the Red Army in 1945. The day remembers the killing of 6 million Jews, which was at that time 2/3 of Europe's Jewish population, and millions of others by the Nazi regime and its collaborators. It was designated by the United Nations General Assembly on November 1st, 2005. The resolution came after a special session was held earlier that year on January 24th to mark the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the Nazi concentration camps and the end of the Holocaust. The resolution urges every member nation of the UN to honor the memory of Holocaust victims, 6 million Jews, along with the countless other members of other minorities. And it encourages the development of educational programs about Holocaust history to help prevent future acts of genocide. It rejects any denial of the Holocaust and as an event and condemns all manifestations of religious intolerance, incitement, harassment, or violence against persons or community based on ethnic origin or religious belief. It also calls for actively preserving Holocaust sites that served as Nazi death camps, concentration camps, forced labor camps, and prisons, as well as for establishing a UN program of outreach and mobilization of society for Holocaust remembrance and education. And just as a note, many countries do observe it on the 27th of January, such as the United Kingdom. And then in the spring, in Israel, they have what's called Yom HaShoah. And that is an additional observance that you'll get more information on later today. So in commemoration of that, we're here today with Rabbi Benjamin Zober and Michael Gorden, who's a past president here at Temple Sinai and is our forever chair of our Buildings and Grounds Committee. And so I'm going to turn it over to them. They'll have a conversation. We'll have questions and answers. And then we're going to welcome you into the lobby and have a snack with us. And I did want to just mention two things. The restroom is across the lobby if you're not familiar, which you probably all are anyway, and no cell phones. And with that, Rabbi Zober.
Thank you, Jill. Thank you, and thank you, Michael, for sitting down for this. I know Jill gave a little taste of an introduction, but I wonder if you can just introduce yourself a little bit for anyone who doesn't. I mean, maybe everyone knows you, I assumed.
Hopefully, if you don't. I don't want to be that popular. So my name is Michael Gorden. I've been a member here for approximately 12 years at Temple Sinai, serving on our board in several different roles for 10 of that. I come from, both of my parents were Jewish, grandparents. I come from a long line of Jewish folks, and feel very deeply in regards to our synagogue and our temple and serving. I am a social worker by trade. Been doing that for about 22 years, 23 years. So I do that for my full-time job. And I do a lot of background mental health stuff in the community.
Thank you. All right. So, well, certainly there will be a time when I get you in that chair and we talk about your history in the community and all of those little bits. But we're here to talk about other parts of your family today, and I wonder if you could kind of introduce us to some of the family members and tell a little bit of their story.
Okay. I do want to commemorate that we had planned on doing children and grandchildren of survivors. And as everyone knows, that finding survivors is getting harder and harder as time goes. And even children of survivors is starting to dwindle down. My uncle, Herb, just passed away a month and a half ago. He was the son of my grandparents, and he was going to be here with us today. Unfortunately, that didn't happen to get his perspective. But I think I, in general, know a little bit of his perspective and how life was. My grandfather made some notes here, so I didn't forget anything, but I'm sure I'll still forget a lot. My grandfather's name was Erich Gottschalk. He was born on December 6, 1912 in Harum, Nordheim, Westfalen, Germany, which sort of borders Holland. And my grandmother, her name was Hilda Pauline Nathan, was born January 14, 1916 in Sindorf, Senrath, Germany. Again, sort of the border towns to Amsterdam in Holland area. My grandfather was 82 years old when he passed away in December 6, 1994, which gave me a lot of time with him as a young adult, which I'm very glad that I had that opportunity. Unfortunately, my grandmother passed away July 15th, 1982. So I was still about 8 years old and still learning about what my grandparents went through and the Holocaust. They were married on February 6th, 1946 in Amsterdam. That's where my dad was born shortly thereafterwards. He was born March 2nd, 1947. My father's name was Jack Gordon, or Jack Gottschalk, actually. That is our German last name. It was changed probably in 1958, somewhere around there. I actually was doing research about that last week, trying to figure out when did the name change happen. And fortunately or unfortunately, when my uncle passed away, I've been going through all of his stuff and finding a lot of information that I didn't have in my hands previously. So it's been very interesting, still a learning experience for me at age 51 to try to determine what was this, when my grandparents came, how did they survive? Because that they went through some very harsh times, surviving, making a life afterwards, and just bringing on another generation. My uncle, who I spoke about, was Herbert Gordon. He was born on March 14th, 1951 in Los Angeles. So he was actually born in the States, whereas my dad wasn't. My grandparents arrived in New York on January 9th, 1948. And then went through the normal route to Philadelphia, lived there for a little while, and then down to LA, and lived in Downey for a good part of my childhood. And that's where I start really learning a little bit about what it's like to be a grandson or a grandchild of a survivor, but also what it sort of felt like to be a child of a survivor. unfortunately, my younger brother, who is 16 months younger than myself, was sick when he was born. And so he went through a bout of cancer. And so through probably his age of 3 and 4, or between 2 and 4, he was constantly getting cancer treatments and stuff. And so during that time, my parents found it hard to try to take care of me and my brother at the same time. So I actually lived with my grandparents for a while. And I think that gave me a different perspective on what it's like, and to have that direct contact. Some of the biggest memories I can come up with is, and knowing some of the history of the camps that my grandmother was in. She was a cook and a housekeeper. She had the privilege of leaving the camp on a daily basis and going to a commandant's house and being a server and doing these services. When I was growing up, and with my grandparents, every day, my grandmother still had a routine. Every day, the house was cleaned. It was dusted. The windows were cleaned daily. The beds were vacuumed out. This was just a routine. And I think I definitely was able to take some of that OCD, and bring that forward. Not as bad now. I have 3 children, and keeping up with them is hard. But I have the same mentality. Like I constantly am feeling like things are a disarray when I look around and see a mess, or when I see dust. And just because I was with that for such a long time with my grandparents. The other thing that a lot of children and grandchildren notice is that whatever's put in front of you to eat, you must eat. You know, your plate, doesn't matter how full, what it was, you didn't have a choice. You ate what was in front of you. Again, I think some of the trauma that's passed down from being in the Holocaust and not having the food in front of you. So I definitely see that in myself. When I sit down, I try to definitely not push that onto my children, but they do know. But my dad and my uncle, I could tell you, were not always the healthiest. Definitely overweight. They were German. They were definitely husky. My grandmother was a very tall, very strong-willed German woman. Whatever she said went in the home. It wasn't up to my grandfather. And so that's just the way the home was. But I definitely got to feel some of that as a young child. Did I know what it was back then? No. I didn't realize what all those routines were and why. We weren't able to speak of the Holocaust and when my grandmother was alive. That word just was not brought up in the home. I don't think it was so much out of depression, or I think it was out of trying to protect the next generation, or in their minds, trying to go to the next generation. Let's wipe this away. We need to survive. We need to move on. And so my grandmother was very much that way. She didn't want to bring those things up and then bring the next level of trauma.
So, thank you. So I wonder if you could share a little bit of the story, a little bit of the account of your grandparents from during the Holocaust.
So one of the biggest memories I have of my grandfather, he was in several camps. I was desperate to learn a lot, but wasn't at a certain age, wasn't living with my grandfather after my grandmother passed away. And I begged my uncle to get as much information, and he did. He interviewed my grandfather, and I have transcripts here. But we went through and tape recorded my grandfather and a lot of stuff. And one of the biggest things I remember growing up is my grandfather had a bullet wound in his leg. And my grandfather was always proud of that wound in his leg. And the reason why, he was shot in Auschwitz coming out of a regular shower. I guess his story was that just one of the Nazis up in the tower just started shooting down, and he got hit through the leg. He said that faith saved him because he did survive Auschwitz because of that. He did not go on the death march. This was close to that January 27th timeframe when the Red Army was there. And I don't have exact date. My grandfather didn't remember, but he did say it was within like a month or so. So he was still a strong young man. He wasn't sent to death at that point with the wound. He was in the infirmary. And so that actually saved his life. They didn't have time during the death march to go back in. There was commands to go in and destroy everything. And the Nazis were scared themselves of the Red Army sitting there and knocking down the doors and getting in there. So my grandfather survived through the liberation process through the Russians. My grandmother, on the other hand, I'm not exactly 100% sure, remember what camp she was in, but I did mention that she was a servant. And so she actually, her best friend's name was Shelley, and I got to know Shelley as an adult a little bit before she passed away. She was bunkmates with Shelley. They became really, really good friends and found each other after the camp. She always told me a story that my grandmother saved her life, but also almost had her killed. And so this story always remained in my heart. My grandmother always hid food and brought it back to her bunkmate and kept her surviving when she wasn't. And then actually was able to convince the commandant that she also was a cleaner and it could come in. And so she was able to bring her in. Well, there was some time that there was some liberation going on and some attacks. And so there was some alarms going off and everyone was scrambling. My grandmother escaped. She took the chance out of the commandant's home to escape. And she did. She came across some Americans in the forest and was shuttered back to, so she was saved in that method. But Shelley almost died because of that. And because they were like, where is Hilda? Where's the other, and she survived. They didn't end up killing her, but it definitely was a point of contention between my grandmother and Shelley, but they were best friends. But again, none of this was ever spoken of before my grandmother passed away. So those were two, I think, important stories that stick in my head.
How did you first come to know that your grandparents were survivors?
So I remember when I lived with them, both of my grandparents were stamped, or I should say inked. They weren't stamped. That was all done by needle. So they both had their numbers. I did hear a lot of stories. Our last name was Gottschalk, but they had changed that to Gordon out of still a little bit of fear, post-traumatic. No one could spell Gottschalk right. And assimilation, as they were staying in the United States, and a lot more assimilation, a lot of last names were changed. And so I very involved in just knowing my grandparents and being proud to be Jewish, being in a Jewish home. And so I found the need to ask questions. I was always curious. I always, as I get older, I look back at it a little bit. I always feel like I had a connection with my grandparents, like that was stronger than even that of my uncle and my dad. It was an innate feeling. And so I always think about, is there the afterlife? Do we come back? And sometimes in my heart, I feel like that at some point in time, that I actually was in the camps as a child and maybe didn't survive. And this was me coming back and being part of this family. I feel very strong to always have, to always teach, always learn, and to always pass on.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So, do you think that your father did he know more than you did just because he was closer to it, or he had heard about it, or was this sort of after your grandmother died, all of the information started coming out?
Yeah, I would say that it's after my grandmother passed away that I could ask questions. How deeply did my father know? I think he knew a lot, and I think he understood a lot. And of course, he explained to me that he wasn't even born in the United States. He was born in Amsterdam. And that's when I finally understood that. I didn't realize that until then. Just took assumption that he was born where everyone else was born in the United States, and really didn't think outside of that realm. I think my dad was depressed. I don't ever think my dad was not depressed. He did the typical. My parents met in Jewish school, or in synagogue, and through Jewish youth groups. We're married. My dad's parents were always very involved in the house of what my dad could do, not do. Very strong-willed on how life should look. My mom's parents were the same on the opposite end, and very controlling. So I don't think my dad really had a lot to do for himself. I think he just did daily life. And I don't think he really wanted to ever expand beyond that. I think it felt very hard for him to do. So on my uncle, on the other hand, didn't have as much of that. He was the second child, was born a little bit more assimilated, and not as much of the immediate trauma since he was born in 1951. I think things had changed a little bit and had calmed down enough that he was very much an entrepreneur. Let me get out there. Let me do what I want. Moved away out of the house very early, before he even graduated high school, and just really getting out and being on his own. But my dad was very much hooked to my grandparents. Never very far away. When my grandparents, when we lived in LA, they did. When grandparents moved to Lake Tahoe, I think they moved to Lake Tahoe in, I think it was 1979. We were here probably 2 or 3 times a year. We travel up to Tahoe. And then when my grandmother passed away, it was short time there afterwards, we moved and came up this way.
So you told us a little bit about how you were shaped by it. And just there in the last few minutes, a little bit about what your father did. So if we can take one more generation, you have 3 kids, and I'm their memories, if any, of the family members who were closer to that is much less, but certainly you had the experiences that you had, and I wonder how you see them, what you've shared with them, what they've learned, and how you see some of their generation taking on this history.
Since I feel it's very important to teach, my kids have all, from the very get-go of them learning and understanding and who we are and why we're Jewish and some of that, I've always fit in the point to explain to them. My grandparents are always on my wall, and so always pointing out to them that was your great-grandparents, and your great-grandparents survived some horrific times, and I've always taught them that, and really got into teaching them the Holocaust education as it came up in school. Not a whole bunch before then, because obviously I think the schools at that time were doing a little bit better job of the right timing and bringing that up. They were always very important. Nathaniel, my firstborn, my oldest, he's named after my grandparents. Nathaniel Eric. So he got my grandfather's middle name, and he goes by Nathan, not shorter than that, and Nathan being my grandmother's surname. And so he's always been curious about that. So very much easy to explain to him why he carries that name and how important that is. So I think he carries that in his heart. I think he definitely is, very much wants to learn and has taught others. When it's come up in his classes, he talks about his grandparents and how they were survivors. And so he's able to bring that on. Shalom is my second child. And he does the same thing. Very much knows how important by us talking about it in the home and learning it in Temple Sinai and programming. They are honored to light a candle every year at our annual State of Nevada event for the Holocaust. And so very much keep my kids educated into why and what we must do to continue that story for years to come. Sasha's now getting to the age, so we're just now starting with her.
Yeah. Well, and three very different kids.
Yes.
And presumably three very different ways that they
Take that in.
take that in and react to that. Well, the sad reality is that every day there are fewer and fewer survivors, and as you mentioned, even fewer of the next generation. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about then that sense of responsibility of what that is, if it's just sharing a story or if there's a sort of a bigger piece to it.
I think there is a bigger piece. You could share stories, but if you don't honor and you don't participate, stories are one way of telling things, but participating and being part of my synagogue and being part of everyone else's lives around and sharing the story that way. It's not just my kids that need to understand it. It's all of us and the other generations to come. But being part of my synagogue and my people and feeling comfortable and going forth. And yes, it wasn't just the Jews among us. So even at my place of employment, my staff and friends of my staff and kids from my staff, I talk about it. I'm open to wherever I'm at. I will talk about it, especially when the days come and the Holocaust is brought up or it hits the news. And we see that a lot, with anti-Semitism. And I always bring that up. And as soon as I hear it, I'm like, let me tell you what it's like. And it's surprising how many folks don't realize what anti-Semitism is and how that plays in our life every day. It played in my life. I went to Reed High School here. I had swastikas put on my desk, and that was back in the late 80s. My grandfather, I'm proud of my grandfather and was so much that in middle school here in town, my grandfather was brought in for show and tell. That's the way I always put it, but he was show and tell at Vaughn Middle School. That was probably in 86 when I went there. And we got to the Holocaust and immediately I was like, let me tell you, I have my grandfather that lives not too far away. He was a survivor and we were able to bring him to class, work with the educator at that time and brought him to class so he could share a little bit. It was a sad day, definitely in my heart and in the hearts of many of my classmates. I was definitely looked at differently from that point forward. I made a lot of friends that were not friends with me before. That was great, but I also made enemies, which does happen. But bring the enemies on. I'm ready. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah,
I think
it's a good answer either way. No, I appreciate that. So I will say that I don't have the same sort of connection. All of my family had come over long before the Holocaust. And so when I study the Holocaust, or when I see artifacts and other sorts of things, I have a connection to it. One, as someone to say, oh, this is something that happened to Jewish people, but more sort of over that is this is a human experience. This is human tragedy. This is something supremely terrible. But I wonder, since you are a bit closer to that, that you have all of the experiences that you do, that when you encounter, whether it is stories or accounts, or even if you've been to any number of Holocaust museums or memorials where they have things, if there's sort of an additional personal piece that kind of hits you.
There certainly is. Anytime it's brought up in movies, or a survivor is speaking, my mind races intensely. Did my grandfather know him? Did they come across, was there a path that was crossed at some point with any of the survivors, especially when they say they were at Auschwitz or Dachau or Westerbrook, or any of the camps that my grandfather went through, and did these paths cross? Every video, live footage, I constantly like, which one's my grandfather? Like, where is he amongst those folks? And I'm sure there was lots of pictures taken. There was a frontline video done back in the early 80s of live footage, which I still have on VHS. And I've looked at it several times, and family members, and like, we believe we've seen my grandfather in those videos, because there were live footage of Auschwitz. And so everything I see, everything I do, that I come across artifacts, just like I was mentioning, even going through my uncle's house the other day, or last couple of weeks, and looking through paperwork. My uncle had been receiving stuff from a gentleman in Germany that's been doing research on my grandfather's side of the family. Came across some information of the Gottschalks, and I'm trying to understand it a little bit. I was showing Judy before this. It's all in Dutch. And so I can't read too much of it, but I'm looking forward to learning more as I can translate it and understanding some of what this story is, and a little bit of history. I have a book that shows, that goes through certain last names, but it shows all the transports from camp to camp, and it's got listings of transports. So I've got that. Came across not sure if it's a wedding book or what this specifically is, but my grandparents were given this by their rabbi on the day they got married. And it's got a special inscription area in it. So I keep coming across stuff, and if I could devote full time to just studying this, I would. It is my number one bucket list item to go to Amsterdam to see where my dad was born, to go to Germany, to visit the camps that my grandparents went through. And I'm hoping one day I can do that, because I think it's really important for me. Maybe some closure, maybe not. But everything I see, Schindler's List, you name it, all the different movies, I have a tough time. I very much want to watch them, and I do, but I do a lot of crying, so I feel a very, very close sense to anything I see. Even our beloved Torah out in the lobby, I spend a lot of time looking at that.
Yeah, for those of you who haven't seen, we have a Holocaust Torah that was rescued, but had been damaged during the Holocaust, and unfortunately, it's not able to be. We can't use it because of its condition and its fragility, but we have it on display so people can see and can take something from that. So I want to ask just a couple more questions and then turn it over to our audience for some of their questions. Do you think there's something that you would kind of a message just that you might want to share, about what it is to encounter someone who's had, your experience with the Holocaust, that might be different from someone who was in it themselves, either just, especially I'm thinking after you talked about the way that your classmates had very different responses. And if you have any thoughts on something you'd like for people to kind of understand or take away.
It's a hard question.
I try.
I think that the knowledge, everyone has a different knowledge base or have learned differently. And depending on what textbook you've seen, tells a different story. There's not a unified message of what the Holocaust was, and how we have to continue to teach post, the history books, and some get history books have had it taken out, and some are 1 or 2 lines now versus a whole chapter. So I think that, I think if I'm answering your question correctly, I think as much as we can continue to tell the whole story and not just a couple of lines, I don't think we change what folks would know or understand. I have to personalize it. I give them the personal facts, and everyone's heard the Anne Frank story, right? That's the common one. I don't have all the specifics, but I've been told through my life that my grandmother actually knew the Frank family. But I've never been able to really put 2 and 2 together or exactly where. But that was there. And my grandmother actually had actually babysat at one point for the Frank family and knew Anne. So I have these stories, but I haven't been able to, but I do bring it up because I think that's how folks these days, when you talk to someone who doesn't realize what the Holocaust was or is not familiar, I bring it up and I say, do you know the story of Anne Frank? Or here's how I can connect you to how that plays in my life and what that means for generations to come.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that absolutely answers my question. Well, and certainly, there's something. Part of the reason that we wanted to sit down with you today was that there's something different about the trauma of Holocaust. That I think that it was not long ago when people would view that and they sort of said, well, okay, that was something bad that happened, but that's it, and you move on. And I think a little bit even in your own family of seeing some of that. Yeah. But we have, as we have gotten further from it and had data and science and been able to look at it, we understand that there is such a thing as intergenerational trauma. That not only do the way the behaviors and attitudes carry through and in shaping the way that people act and walk through the world, but there are also even biological and genetic markers that go with that. I know that's something that I believe will be part of the conversation for Yom HaShoah in the spring in April, and we may hear a little bit about that later because we hope that people will come to that. So these fit together really, really nicely on that. But it is certainly it speaks to the enormity of the event, that it is something that is not just gotten past or gotten over, and that certainly there are a number of different ways that we can take that. And I appreciate you sharing your experiences, because it seems to me like you have been able to take a look at a lot of that, and certainly in being open with your kids and open with people who share with you, that it's a much healthier attitude towards it, both in terms of being able to share things and get it out and not keeping it a secret or locked away, but also from the standpoint of helping people understand and telling these very, very important stories. So thank you. So I will turn it over now to questions. If you are present here, please, please, please only speak when you have the microphone so that the people who are online can hear you. And if we have some questions from the online folks, I hope Tommy will relay them to us and then we will share it for the folks who are present.
Do I understand that you have audio recordings of interviews with your grandfather,
Yes, that's correct.
and he was talking comfortably and freely about what happened?
Yes, and this was several years after my grandmother had passed away. This is sort of later in life. So I spent every time we came, and I mentioned that after my grandmother passed away, we made several trips up to Tahoe. I would sit with my grandfather on the couch. He loved walnuts. And so he always had bags of walnuts that we had to crack. And we would just sit there and I would just start asking questions and trying to learn about his past and where he came from. My grandfather was a cattle dealer. His father, his grandfather, full line of cattle dealers. Even in Downey, they were cattle dealers. He was a cattle dealer for a while. And so cattle.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Jewish cowboys, I guess.
Yep. Everything from raising cattle to having them butchered and sold and my dad said no scraps ever went uneaten from an animal and in their life. There's some things I won't eat.
You might have said this, but what year were your grandparents put into the camps?
So my and actually I had some of the transcripts here, and if we had hours and hours, I could go through a lot of it. But my grandfather, actually, the first camp he went into, and I had marked it on here, was in 1938 because he went over the border. So he went from Germany. My grandfather had passed away in 38, or my great grandfather. And so they had to sell the ranch, whatever property it was. And my grandfather was looking for work and there was no work in their small town. So he crossed over the border into Holland. And that wasn't necessarily allowed. So he was in a work camp in Holland, not Nazi based at the beginning. And so this was the time, and this is what happened back then. So he was in that and started there and was just a worker in that area until the Nazis took over and started moving folks around. So just ironically was in a work camp, basically.
I have another question. What story did your grandfather tell the children when he was at the show and tell, when he was asked to share?
You know what? I honestly couldn't remember. I can't remember exactly what kind of questions. I think the questions were driven by the teacher. And actually some of that frontline video I talked about was actually shown in class. We had a special permission that was sent around and they were actually able to show all the graphic and nudity and stuff, some of that actual footage in my class at that time. So I wish I could remember. That was 30 some years ago.
Yeah. Good afternoon. Just one comment and one question. My mother was in London during the Blitz in the Second World War, and she obviously schools weren't functioning, but she did start working for a Jewish tailor, Mr. Solomon's, and she heard firsthand that they had managed to get out of Europe in time to get it away from all of the Holocaust. But I can tell you that during the Blitz, when there was concerns the Nazis would cross the channel, there was great fear. They had seen things coming, but they thought they were safe. And it really, she remembers that her friends were very, very concerned. So I can't even imagine what it had been like to have been still in Germany. My question is more of a theological one, really. I forget the name of the rabbi, but there's a very famous book, Why Do Bad Things Happen to Good People?
Yeah, Harold Kushner.
Yeah.
Yes.
And I've often wondered, for the people that survived, and I don't know whether your family, certainly not when your grandmother was alive, but afterwards, ever had a sense of being deserted by God or doubting their faith because of that?
No. So I definitely come from all the family around me, my aunts and uncles, especially on my dad's side, very involved in their synagogues. And so I think I naturally, progressively got that from my relatives. And that was really on my dad's side. On my mom's side, and one of the questions I had asked myself actually before we started this, like I really never brought up was my grandfather really, at growing up, he was Reform or conservative. He was a founding member of Temple Bat Yam up in Tahoe, South Lake Tahoe. I know his doors were always open to traveling rabbis at his house. So I know he was conservative, but I never really saw that part or understood that part. I think it was just regular life for us. But beyond that, I don't know if how conservative they were in Germany, or if that just went away once the camps happened, or I don't know any of that type of history. So that bothers me a little bit. As I started thinking about it the other day, it's like, where is that? Where was that line and how strong was it? I do know that there was rabbis in our family. There was so I know we're definitely, got something there. Just don't know specifically what. But never once did we ever give up on the thought of God and being part of our institution.
Quick question about the Red Army and the liberation from the Red Army. So I've heard stories about how the Red Army treated the German civilians because of all the wars and the destruction in Russia. Did the Red Army see the Jewish people more as had gone through similar things and so treat them with more respect, or how did the Red Army treat the Jewish people when they liberated them?
You know what? Honestly, I can't really answer that too much. I do know that my grandfather was respectful of talking about the liberation, but things weren't automatically changed immediately. They were still in the camp for a while until other services came in. It wasn't like it was an immediate change. So I don't think I really got a sense of anything different or how that was. I'm going to assume, being a social worker and then having some psychology background, that I'm sure that things were just disarray everywhere. So I don't think there was a lot of time to really think that through, or how everyone started treating each other. I know they tried to round up Nazis, and probably got a lot mixed up there too. Who knows? And I guess, it's hard to say, but not every Nazi was bad either. And I've heard those type of stories from my grandparents or my grandfather too, because my grandfather was very respectful. And sometimes he said, he would point out that certain camps or that he was in, that there was Nazis that actually took care of them and fed them and did not, refuse to shoot and refuse to do stuff. So there was some good and in consciousness in some folks. So it's hard to probably put a pin in that one. But I did, just real quick, John, before you answer, because I wanted to go back and I meant to say this. So, and I think it was Gary, right? When he was talking about those who were able to get out beforehand or, just, escape the country. My grandfather did have a sister. Her name was Herta. And she actually was a little older and had moved out of Germany prior to, and moved to other places in Europe. I don't know exactly where. I think she was in London a little bit and stuff, and that's why that brought that up. But post-Holocaust, when they were reunited again, and my grandparents were married, because they found each other afterwards, there was a lot of disagreements about life at that point. Because again, my grandfather would probably, in his mind, said that, and he didn't have a relationship with her anymore, was that she didn't understand. She never went through it. So she didn't get along with my grandmother. And my grandfather very much said, I take, my wife's side. And so there was some disagreement. That's all I ever heard a little bit of. I don't know the details or anything else, but I do know there was a separation at that point, and they never spoke again.
Michael, first, thank you so much. I just find it so heartbreaking, but I'm always interested in history and, like with you, genealogy and understanding history. You answered one question there. I had two questions. One, if your family discovered other family members after the war, and second, you'd mentioned that your wish is to be able to go to Amsterdam, go to Holland, and do some research. Has anyone in your family done that?
I don't know if anyone specifically has gone that route. I do know that I do have some, my grandfather's cousin did some research and actually has been there, and got a little bit from him, still older. He's, and I have a lot of family members that are, I still have my dad's cousin who's a childhood survivor, still doesn't speak much about it, and she's in her 90s, and won't talk, or doesn't. We just don't talk about that. And I have a cousin who lives in Israel who's done a lot of research genealogy, but I don't think any of them have actually just gone and done the trip and traveled through the Holocaust, through the.
I just wanted to mention about maybe 5-6 years ago, I did go to Amsterdam, and I did see there's a Holocaust museum there as well. And I'm sure you know of that. And,
Yep.
As you're discussing the story of your family, I just keep thinking about there might be pictures there.
Right.
And so anyhow, my heart's there.
Thank you. Yeah. One of these days.
You mentioned that the Holocaust wasn't discussed in your household as a child. What were discussions about anti-Semitism like growing up, either from your grandparents, your uncle, your parents?
I don't think there was really specific conversations about anti-Semitism. Being proud to be Jewish, or when outside of the home and talking about being Jewish and being proud. And I actually have a Mogen David that was passed down to me from my grandfather. When I turned 16, he had one made for me, special. And I've always worn it. Some of you guys have seen it, but the chain broke about a year and a half ago. And one of these days that'll be fixed again. But I was always proud. So I always wore my Mogen David outside. As a young kid, I can tell you that when we went out in the community, if I started talking about that, I was hushed by my dad, my parents. And I think it's the trauma of the time. My middle son, Shalom, even in 15 years ago when he was born, 16 years ago, when we decided to name him Shalom, I had very negative output from both sides of my family, from relatives going, don't do that. Don't do that. And I was like, why? And like you're just putting a target on him. And so it was very much a need for my wife and I to go, that's not a target. That's something to be proud of. And so
you were talking about trauma and generational trauma. How do you think, how has that knowledge affected you, and how do you think that knowledge will affect your kids one day?
I think for me, I think I've taken on the role of providing. Like, I don't stop. I am, if someone needs help, I will help them. It doesn't matter what is happening in my own personal life or how down I might be, or if it's my last dollar, I'm always putting forth. And I think that's something I learned from my grandparents. Like, it doesn't matter what you have, you've got to help others, you've got to push forth. And I think that was one of the hardest parts of my trauma that I still find hard to these days. I've gotten a little better, but to me, that's what life is about, is to help others and to make sure other people survive and other people get what they need, and psychologically and do mental health and social work. I find that was just part of me. I probably became a social worker when I was like 11 years old. Honestly, if I look back, I was the parent in my household over my parents. And I think that was just me being raised a little differently in a different household for a little while, and seeing that and understanding that. My grandparents were never greedy, always gave, even, being Holocaust survivors, they were very much, we've got to help people. So
I noticed there's been a great uptick in anti-Semitism in half the globe. It's alarming. I'm not going to talk about or ask you about why. I have my own theories about why, but how do you fight the misinformation and disinformation that is rampant?
I guess it's just, I know we could spend. I think that just making sure you're consistent in telling what the knowledge and passing it. Everyone who tries to deny it, and I've had deniers in front of me and say it didn't happen, and I just say, well, I lived with my grandparents. I have their stamps. I have their history. I know what happened in my mind and written down. And so I just continue to fight forward with that, information. This is what happened. And I fight forward in just educating. Anti-Semitism is based off of those who don't know or don't understand, and they just listen to others. Hate gets moved around much easier than love. Of course, it makes me angry, but that doesn't fix anything. Walking around being angry all the time, I can't fix it if I'm going to be angry. I can only fix it if I'm going to educate and move forward.
Michael, another question. Gosh, I just lost my train of thought right now. But you had mentioned that going through your uncle's home, you discovered a few things that you shared with us. Was there any like real aha moments that you had discovered? And two, remember the next question. You also mentioned that you have a transcript of your grandfather. Have you ever thought of having that published?
Many times I've thought, I probably could sit down and write a book if I could find 5 minutes. And so I have not. And I don't know if maybe this is something I pass on to one of my kids and say, hey, do you guys want to write a book or get more? I think I need more research to define some of this and to really put it in. I mean, my grandfather's words are great. I could probably write a short story, but I'd like to put more evidence in there. And I think part of that may be doing that traveling, going to Amsterdam, going to all the camps and really getting in there and digging in a little bit more. And I know, and I want to just take a step back. I'm always angry, but I don't think being forwardly angry is probably what I meant. I mean, internally, I'm always angry that my grandparents went through that, or anybody went through that. Dramatic. How anyone survived, is just amazing. My grandfather, I think he said he came out at 80 some pounds, and he went in at almost 200. So how anybody, like mentally and physically and stuff survived that trauma always makes me angry. But I still want to teach love going forward and not always hate going forward. That's where I think I really meant that, I just can't forwardly go around and telling everyone how angry I am, because I don't think that solves anything. That means.
So I wanted to, before we close out, I did, as I mentioned, wanted to call special attention to our program. Judy, I don't know if you want to tell us about the Yom HaShoah event, because you've put heart and soul into it as usual.
So my name is Judy Schumer, and Gay Warner and I are co-chairs of the annual Reno Holocaust Day of Remembrance. And we've been doing it together for now. We did it 7 times, 8 times. I've lost count. And it takes place every year at the Atlantis Hotel. And it is co-sponsored by OLLI, the Osher Lifelong Learning Institute, and the Governor's Advisory Council on Education related to the Holocaust. And what a wonderful tie-in to what was going on today, because this year our theme is life and hope in the aftermath of the Holocaust. And we will talk about what happened the next day, what happened to people after they survived, and how did they survive? How did they survive in the displaced persons camps? How did they survive in other countries? And what happened to their children and grandchildren? And our keynote speaker this year, Dr. Harold Koplowitz, is the founder of the Child Mind Institute. He is a world-renowned psychiatrist, speaker, author, and the son of Holocaust survivors. And he will speak about survivors' experiences and the intergenerational transmission of Holocaust trauma. So we expect it to be, as always, a wonderful program. Last year, we had almost 600 people attend, including many local officials, state officials, representatives of the governor, and our senators. And we expect the same this year. And we hope you can attend. And right now, we only have, I've sent out the save the date. Our official flyer and invitation comes out first week of March? About then. It's the printer. It's generally the first week of March. And I send out the flyers and the official invitation. We do ask for registration because it's free, of course, but that's what the Atlantis Hotel wants to know. Are we having 110 people or having 610 people? So if you would like to, give me your email address before we leave today, I would be happy to put you on the list so that you get the official invitation as soon as I send it out, first week of March. Yes, and so you can certainly RSVP. But if you'd like to, I'd be happy to take your email address, and you and your friends, relatives, neighbors can be on the list. So anyway, thank you. If you had any questions, I'd be happy to answer it later. But it's, as always, going to be a remarkable event. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have everyone's email here, so unless anyone's opposed to my giving it to Judy, I can give them all to you. Everyone's okay with that? I'll send you the list.
Is my name on that list?
Let me think.
Okay.
I just wanted to make a quick comment. Michael, before when you commented about how your relatives didn't choose to talk about the Holocaust, it triggered for me. That was definitely trauma that went through all of our families, because it made me remember when I was 8 or 10 years old, every Sunday, Cousin Joseph would come for lunch. And I didn't understand why, no matter how hot it was outside, Cousin Joseph always wore a long sleeve shirt. And you weren't allowed to put on the television, because this was, I'm dating myself, forgive me, but there would still be news coverage about the Holocaust. There could be a comment made. You weren't allowed to watch TV when Cousin Joseph came. And I always wondered about the shirt. And then eventually my parents told me that Cousin Joseph had survived the Holocaust. And he had been, I guess we'd call it a cobbler. And he would come over and make little purses with my mom because she was a seamstress. But we were never allowed to ask anything. Nobody would talk about it. So what you're saying is probably very common to many of our families.
Yep.
Yeah.
I have a totally different experience. My parents were Holocaust survivors. In our home, this was almost daily conversation. We were on the other extreme. My sister and I were never allowed to forget what happened. Relatives' names were mentioned all the time. And it was interesting that the friends that came to my parents' home, who were also survivors, I knew every story because this is what they talked about. And we're talking about from the time I was 6 or 7 years old. And my sister was a lot older than I am. We were different because this was constantly in our home, which is why I know all of these stories, because this was dinner table conversation in my home.
Thank you.
Thank you, Judy. And I wish that was the case in mine. I mean, I wish I knew more. I appreciate that.
Something to consider is that Judaism in many ways is a religion of remembering, that we are not only at times we are commanded to remember things, but so much of it is dependent upon that. And I think the enormity of something like the Holocaust, we see it in the way that the varied reactions, right, to and how people remember, right, that on one hand it is not to be spoken of, and in other families it is absolutely must be and needs to be and will be constantly spoken of. And I think in itself it shows how significant an event it was to have such opposing sorts of reactions. And as you said, unfortunately, I not just because I'm a rabbi or a historian of these sorts of things, but I think that there is true wisdom and benefit to remembering things and to holding things. That we study history to understand the present and plan for the future, and it's something that I try to impart and share and do, and I know that there are many others who do, particularly in this area. And so I'm glad that we are able to have spaces like this where we share these things, and that there are transcripts of things, and that there are a number of efforts that preserve these stories that will remain long after those close to the events have gone. So, and I think that it also is part of our duty, whatever our relationship to this is, that this is part of the human story. This is part of history. This is part of something that plays on our moral obligations to one another, and being able to learn these things and share these things and pass them on for the sake of the future is one of the most important things that we can do.
Thank you, Rabbi Ben. I wanted to mention also, if you haven't seen it, there's a wonderful Ken Burns documentary. I think it was 3 parts on PBS called The United States in the Holocaust. And it's a perspective that you may not be aware of, what was happening in our country when that was happening across the world. So, and Michael, I need to thank you, because when you say that your mission, your purpose is to educate, and to be part of a synagogue. There is not 1 inch of this synagogue that this man has not touched. And I mean physically, aside from spiritually, and there is not one physical part. And so thank you.
Thank you.
So for that, you
My
are
pleasure.
truly representing your grandparents, and they would have such nachas from you.
Yes.
So thank you. With no other questions, we're going to invite you to have a nash with us in the lobby. February 16th, Rabbi Sarah Zober is going to be here talking about Jewish love songs, and it's Valentine's Day, so it would be. She'll be also, I believe, she'll be singing. Or you're not.
We can only hope.
Okay, but either way, the theme is Jewish love songs. So if you're free and want to join us, you know the place and you know the time. And then in March, Rabbi Ben will be speaking with Barbara Weinberg, who's been almost a 50-year member, I think, of our synagogue here and was a past president. Her husband built anything you see that's wood. And in April 27th, one of our members, Daryl Dworkin, has a long history in the toy industry. And he's going to be talking about Jews in the toy industry. So that should be really interesting as well. So if there's nothing else, then please join us for some refreshments. And thanks for coming out in this lovely weather. We really appreciate it. And please drive safely. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you.